The village of Zambalo was a place where the sun always seemed to shine, where laughter echoed through the trees, and where families sat together under the moonlight, telling stories of their ancestors. But for young Nabinti, the warmth of her world shattered the day her mother, Zalira, took her last breath. Zalira had been a gentle woman, known for her kindness and wisdom. She had raised Nabinti with love, teaching her the values of patience and resilience. But death did not wait for kindness, and one fateful evening, Zalira closed her eyes forever, leaving her daughter alone in a world that was about to become a nightmare. Nabinti's father, Bukani, was a respected trader, often traveling from village to village. Devastated by his wife's death, he believed that his daughter needed a mother's care, someone to guide her as she grew into a woman. So, within months of Zalira's passing, he brought home a new wife, Zalira. She arrived with soft words and warm smiles, her daughter, Aduma, by her side. To the villagers, she seemed like a blessing, a woman who could heal the wounds of loss. To Nabinti, she was a stranger, but she hoped, with all her heart, that Zalira would bring back some of the love that had disappeared with her mother. For a while, it seemed like things would be okay. Zalira would brush Nabinti's hair and hum lullabies in the evening. She cooked warm meals and sat beside Bukani, speaking softly as she helped him manage the household. The village women whispered among themselves, admiring how quickly Bukani had found a good woman to take care of his home. Even Nabinti, hesitant at first, started to believe that maybe, just maybe, Zalira could love her. But the moment Bukani left for his first trading trip, the mask fell. The soft voice turned sharp, the gentle hands became rough. The first night without Bukani, Zalira took away Nabinti's sleeping mat and forced her to lie on the cold, hard ground. "You are no longer the daughter of this house," she hissed. "You are nothing but a servant." At first, Nabinti thought it was a misunderstanding. Perhaps Zalira was just tired, or maybe she was testing her, but the cruelty only grew. The food portions became smaller until she was left with only scraps. Aduma, who had once smiled at her like a sister, now smirked as she watched her suffer. Every day brought a new punishment, a new reason for Zalira to remind Nabinti that she was powerless. Nabinti longed for her father's return, hoping he would see what was happening and stop it. But every time Bukani came home, Zalira put on her mask again, showering Nabinti with fake affection in front of him. And each time Bukani left, the mask came off, revealing the monster underneath. The moment Bukani left for his long trading trips, the house became a place of nightmares for Nabinti. The warmth that once filled her home had disappeared, replaced by cold silence and the sharp sting of cruelty. Zalira no longer pretended to care. She treated Nabinti like she was worthless, someone who did not deserve kindness or love. The first thing she took away was Nabinti's bed. "A servant does not sleep in comfort," Zalira sneered, dragging her mat outside and throwing it into the dirt. From that night on, Nabinti was forced to sleep on the cold, hard floor near the kitchen, curled up like an abandoned dog. The days became even worse. While Aduma sat comfortably, eating full meals and wearing new clothes, Nabinti was given the smallest scraps, barely enough to survive. If she ever complained or begged for more, Zalira would slap her across the face and say, "Be grateful you have anything at all." Aduma, once a girl who smiled at Nabinti like a sister, now took pleasure in her suffering. She laughed when Zalira made Nabinti scrub the floors until her hands bled. She smirked when Nabinti shivered from hunger. If Nabinti ever tried to sit down and rest, Aduma would kick dust at her and say, "Get up, you are nothing in this house." But through it all, Nabinti held on to one thing, her mother's old storybook. It was the only thing she had left of Zalira, the only piece of warmth in her dark world. Late at night, when everyone was asleep, she would take it out and run her fingers over the pages, whispering the words her mother used to read to her. Those stories gave her strength. They reminded her that she was more than just a servant. She was Zalira's daughter. One night, as she sat in a corner, reading by the dim light of a candle, Zalira caught her. "What is this?" she hissed, snatching the book from Nabinti's hands. Nabinti scrambled to take it back, her heart pounding. "Please, it belonged to my mother," she pleaded. But Zalira only laughed, her eyes burning with hatred. "Your mother is gone, and you are nothing but a nameless girl." With that, she threw the book into the fire. Nabinti screamed, lunging forward to save it, but Aduma grabbed her, pulling her back as the flames swallowed the pages. Tears streamed down Nabinti's face as she watched the only memory of her mother turn to ashes. Zalira grabbed her by the arm and yanked her close. "You are nothing, and no one will ever remember you," she whispered. Then she shoved Nabinti to the ground and walked away, laughing as she disappeared into the darkness. That night, for the first time, Nabinti truly understood. She was alone, and no one was coming to save her. The night was quiet. The only sound was the distant chirping of cricket. But inside the house, a storm was brewing. Zalira was furious. She had already burned the last thing Nabinti held dear, yet the girl still had fight in her eyes. She wanted to break her completely, to erase every trace of defiance left in her. With a cruel smile, Zalira grabbed Nabinti by the arm and dragged her to the center of the room. "You think you are still someone?" she spat. "You think you have a name, a life, a place in this world?" Nabinti didn't answer. She knew nothing she said would change Zalira's cruelty, but silence only fueled Zalira's anger. In a fit of rage, she stormed to the fire, picking up a knife. The blade gleamed orange as it heated in the flames. Nabinti's heart pounded as she realized what was about to happen. She struggled, but Zalira was too strong. She shoved Nabinti onto the ground and tied her hands and feet with thick rope. "Since you don't have a name, I will give you mine," Zalira sneered. She pulled the knife from the fire, the metal glowing with unbearable heat. Nabinti's breath came in short gasps as panic filled her chest. "No, please," she begged, her voice shaking, but Zalira's grip was firm. Then, with slow, deliberate cruelty, she pressed the searing blade against Nabinti's back. The pain was instant and unbearable. A scream tore from Nabinti's throat, raw and full of agony. It felt as if her skin was being ripped apart, the fire eating into her flesh. Zalira carved the letters deep, her name, Zalira, branding Nabinti as if she were nothing more than a piece of livestock. Aduma, who had been watching from the corner, turned pale. For the first time, fear flickered in her eyes. She had enjoyed her mother's cruelty before, laughing when Nabinti suffered. But this was different. She wanted to speak, to tell her mother to stop. But the words never left her lips. She was too afraid. The smell of burning flesh filled the air. Nabinti's screams grew weaker. Her body trembled violently, her nails digging into the dirt as she tried to endure the torture. But the pain was too much. Darkness crept into the edges of her vision. Her breathing slowed. Then, suddenly, everything faded. The world around her disappeared. Nabinti went still. Aduma gasped, stepping forward. "Mother, she's not moving," she whispered, her voice shaking. Zalira pulled the knife away and scoffed, wiping the sweat from her forehead. "Good," she muttered. She stood up, looking down at Nabinti's unconscious body. "Let this be a lesson. She belongs to me now." Then she turned and walked away, leaving Nabinti lying on the cold floor, her back bleeding, her body lifeless, and her spirit shattered. The first rays of sunlight crept into the house, casting long shadows across the dirt floor where Nabinti lay. Her back burned with unbearable pain, each breath sending waves of agony through her body. Dried blood clung to her torn dress, and her wrists were raw from struggling against the ropes the night before. She knew if she stayed, she wouldn't survive another day. With the little strength she had left, she pushed herself up, biting her lip to keep from crying out. The house was silent. Zalira and Aduma were still asleep. Now was her chance. She stumbled toward the door, her legs weak and shaking beneath her. Every step sent fire through her back, but she couldn't stop. She had to keep going. The cool morning air hit her face as she stepped outside, and for the first time in years, she felt something close to freedom. She didn't know where she was running to. All she knew was that she had to get away, away from the pain, away from Zalira's madness. Her bare feet pounded against the earth as she pushed forward, deeper into the unknown. The towering trees of the forest surrounded her, their thick branches blocking out the sun, but she was too weak. The world spun around her, her vision blurred, and before she could take another step, her knees gave out. She collapsed near the riverbank, her body too broken to move. The water shimmered under the morning light, but Nabinti could barely keep her eyes open. She thought this was the end. Then, a voice, soft but firm. "Child, can you hear me?" A pair of gentle hands touched her shoulder, rolling her onto her side. Nabinti blinked up at the face of an old woman, her dark eyes filled with concern. The woman touched Nabinti's forehead, feeling her burning skin, then carefully turned her over, gasping when she saw the deep scars carved into her back. "This evil," the woman murmured, shaking her head. "Who did this to you?" But Nabinti was too weak to answer. Her body trembled, and the last thing she saw before the world turned black was the woman lifting her with surprising strength. When she woke again, she was lying on a soft bed, wrapped in warm blankets. The scent of herbs filled the air. The old woman sat beside her, grinding leaves into a paste. "You are safe now," she said. For the first time in years, Nabinti felt something she had forgotten: comfort. The woman's name was Jumoke, a herbalist who lived deep in the forest. Over the next weeks, she treated Nabinti's wounds with special medicines, her hands always careful, her voice always soothing. But Jumoke didn't just heal Nabinti's body. She taught her something even more powerful: the secrets of healing, the way of herbs, and the strength hidden in knowledge. And for the first time in her life, Nabinti began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could be something more than just a girl with scars. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months, and soon, years had passed. Under Jumoke's care, Nabinti transformed. The frail, broken girl who had once collapsed by the river was gone. In her place stood a strong, intelligent young woman. Jumoke had taught her everything: how to heal wounds, cure sickness, and use nature's gifts to bring life back to the suffering. Nabinti listened, learned, and practiced, her hands becoming as skilled as her mentors. But no amount of healing could erase the past. Every night, she traced the scars on her back with her fingers, feeling the deep grooves of Zalira's name burned into her skin. The pain had faded, but the memory never left. The anger inside her had turned into something stronger: determination. She was no longer the helpless girl who had been tortured and tossed aside. She was a healer now. She understood the power of kindness, of wisdom, of patience. But she also knew that some wounds could not be ignored. One evening, as she sat outside Jumoke's hut, watching the sky darken into shades of deep purple and gold, she made her decision. She would return to Zambalo. Jumoke, who always seemed to understand what was in Nabinti's heart, nodded as if she had been expecting this. "You are not going back for revenge," she said gently. "You are going for something greater." Nabinti met her gaze. "For justice," she whispered. Zalira had taken everything from her: her home, her childhood, her dignity, but she had not taken Nabinti's spirit. And now, Nabinti would return, not as a weak, powerless girl, but as a woman with wisdom, with strength, and with a purpose. The people of Zambalo had turned a blind eye to her suffering, but this time they would see. This time they would hear, and when they did, they would cry. Nabinti stepped cautiously into the village of Zambalo, her heart pounding with both anticipation and dread. The place she once called home now looked unfamiliar, as if it had changed while she was away. Every corner of the village whispered secrets of neglect and hidden cruelty. As she walked the dusty main road, she saw a grand mansion where before there was only a humble home. Through the ornate windows, she could glimpse the luxurious life her stepmother, Zalira, now enjoyed. Zalira had transformed the modest house into a symbol of wealth and power, controlling every bit of her late husband, Bukani's fortune. The sharp contrast between Nabinti's painful past and Zalira's newfound opulence struck her like a wave, leaving her both shocked and heartbroken. In the center of the village, Nabinti's eyes fell on her father, Bukani. The once strong and respected trader now appeared feeble and broken. He sat on a worn-out bench outside a small, crumbling building, his face creased with sorrow and his eyes vacant with despair. His blindness was not only physical, it seemed as if he could no longer see the truth that lay right in front of him. Unaware of the suffering unfolding behind closed doors at home, Bukani clung to old routines, leaving him isolated in a world where his voice and authority had slowly been eroded. Nabinti's heart ached for him, knowing that he had been misled and manipulated by Zalira, who had taken control of everything he once held dear. Worse still, Nabinti soon learned of the fate that had befallen Aduma. The girl who had once shared moments of mockery and cruelty with her had grown into a young woman, trapped by her own choices. Aduma's life was now bound by an unhappy engagement, a union arranged by Zalira to secure even more wealth and social standing. The engagement was nothing more than a gilded cage, forcing Aduma into a life of duty and subservience. Nabinti felt a pang of pity mixed with resentment. Aduma had been a willing participant in her own cruelty, yet now she was the one who suffered under the strict rules set by Zalira. It was a cruel twist of fate that the one who had laughed at Nabinti's pain now wore a mask of sorrow and resignation. Every step Nabinti took deepened the shock that surged within her. The village that had once been filled with simple joys was now overshadowed by deceit, oppression, and hidden suffering. She saw people whispering in the market, their eyes darting nervously when they caught a glimpse of her. Nabinti's return stirred memories and ignited feelings long buried under the weight of her past. The once gentle and nurturing community had been slowly molded into a realm of secrets and lies by Zalira's iron grip. In that moment, Nabinti made a silent vow. The injustice that had twisted the lives of those she once loved would not continue unchecked. Though her heart still bore scars of pain and betrayal, she knew that it was time to speak the truth. The shocking reality of Zalira's luxurious facade, her father's sorrowful blindness, and Aduma's trapped existence would no longer remain hidden. Nabinti's return marked the beginning of a reckoning, a chance to restore honesty and justice in the village of Zambalo. The village of Zambalo had always honored the Day of Truth. It was the one day in the year when no one was allowed to hide their pain, when secrets were brought into the light, and when the weight of unspoken burdens was finally lifted. People gathered in the village square, standing beneath the towering baobab tree, the heart of their community. Elders sat in a circle, listening as villagers stepped forward, sharing their struggles, regrets, and confessions. Nabinti stood at the back of the crowd, her heart pounding as she watched the ceremony unfold. She had waited for this moment. This was her chance, not for revenge, but for truth. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward. The murmurs grew as people recognized her. Many had assumed she had died years ago, lost in the wilderness, but here she was, standing before them, stronger than ever. Silence fell as Nabinti reached the center of the square. Her hands trembled slightly as she unclasped the shawl draped over her shoulders. Slowly, she turned her back to the crowd and let the fabric slip away. Gasps echoed through the square. A woman covered her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. An elder gripped his walking stick, his knuckles white with rage. Others turned away, unable to bear the sight. There, etched into her skin, was the name Zalira, burned into her flesh like a brand of ownership. The scars, though faded with time, still told a story of unbearable cruelty. A man clenched his fists. "Who did this to you?" he demanded, though deep down, many already knew the answer. Nabinti turned to face them, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Zalira," she said, "the woman who stole my mother's place, the woman who called me worthless, the woman who did this." The crowd erupted. Some people sobbed openly, others shook their heads in disbelief. A young boy clung to his mother's dress, his wide eyes filled with confusion. The elders whispered among themselves, their expressions grave. In the midst of it all, Zalira stood frozen in place, her once proud face drained of color as she saw the rage building in the villagers' eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, to deny, to defend herself, but no words came. Bukani, blind and unaware of his surroundings, lifted his head. "What is happening?" he asked weakly. Nabinti turned to him, her voice soft but firm. "Father, it's time you finally hear the truth." The crowd roared with anger, demanding justice, demanding answers. The woman who had ruled over them with arrogance and cruelty was now standing at the edge of her own downfall. And Nabinti, the girl who had once been broken, was now the one holding the power of truth in her hands. The moment the truth was revealed, Bukani's world shattered. The blind old man, once a strong and respected trader, now sat trembling in the center of the village, his face pale, his hands clutching the air as if trying to grasp a reality he had refused to see for years. His only daughter, the child he thought had been lost forever, stood before him, her back forever marked with the name of the woman he had trusted. Tears streamed down his wrinkled face as he collapsed to his knees. "I was blind in more ways than one," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Nabinti, my child, what have I done?" The village was silent, the weight of his grief pressing down on everyone. Even those who had once turned a blind eye to Zalira's cruelty now hung their heads in shame. But the elders had no time for pity. Justice had to be served. Elder Kafaru, the wisest among them, stepped forward. His eyes, sharp as a hawk's, locked onto Zalira, who stood trembling. "For your wickedness, for the suffering you inflicted on a motherless child, for the lies you fed this village for years, you are hereby banished from Zambalo forever." His voice rang through the air like thunder. A murmur of agreement swept through the crowd. Faces that once greeted Zalira with forced respect were now filled with disgust. The woman who had lived in luxury, who had controlled Bukani's wealth, who had tormented an innocent girl, now stood with nothing but the fear in her eyes. Zalira dropped to her knees, clawing at the dirt. "No, please," she wailed. "I beg you. I only did what I thought was best. I raised her like my own." Nabinti flinched at those words, but she did not speak. She did not need to. The scars on her back spoke louder than anything she could say. Aduma, standing beside her mother, was pale with fear. She had always enjoyed her mother's cruelty when it was at Nabinti's expense, but now that same cruelty was turning on her. "Mother," she whispered, stepping away, as if realizing for the first time that Zalira was a sinking ship, and she was about to be dragged down with her. "Aduma, too, will leave this village," another elder declared. She stood by and did nothing. She laughed while another suffered. "There is no place for such a heart in Zambalo." Aduma's face twisted in horror. "No, please, where will we go? We have nowhere." "Then you will wander, as all those without honor do," Kafaru said sternly. Zalira screamed, her once beautiful face contorted with despair. She turned to Bokani, her last hope. "Please, my husband, say something. Don't let them do this." But Bukani did not answer. He only turned his face away, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The decision had been made. Zalira and Aduma were no longer part of Zambalo. As the dust settled in Zambalo, the village slowly returned to peace. The dark shadow that had loomed over Nabinti's life for years had finally been lifted. No longer a frightened girl hiding in the shadows, she now stood tall, her scars no longer a mark of pain, but a symbol of survival. With Zalira and Aduma gone, the house that had once been a prison for Nabinti now felt different. Bukani, weak and filled with regret, leaned heavily on his daughter's care. The man who had once been blinded by love for the wrong woman now relied on the very child he had abandoned. Nabinti did not hate him. She saw the pain in his face, the sorrow in his voice. Though he could not see her, she knew he felt her presence. "I should have protected you," he whispered one evening, gripping her hand tightly. "I let you suffer in my own house, and for that, I will never forgive myself." Nabinti held back tears. She had carried anger for so long, but now she saw no use for it. "You are my father," she said softly, "and I will take care of you." With the support of the village elders, Nabinti took on a new purpose. She rebuilt the old healing center, bringing back the knowledge that had been lost over time. The lessons she had learned from Jumoki became a gift to her people. Sick children, wounded hunters, and struggling mothers all came to her, and she healed them with the same gentle hands that had once tended to her own scars. One day, as Nabinti prepared herbs, she heard soft footsteps behind her. She turned to see Aduma standing there, her once proud face now clouded with shame. She hesitated before speaking. "I was a coward," Aduma admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I let my mother destroy you. I laughed when you cried. I watched you suffer and said nothing." Nabinti stared at her stepsister, waiting. Aduma's eyes filled with tears. "I can't undo the past, but I need you to know, I am sorry." The silence stretched between them, heavy with years of cruelty and regret. Finally, Nabinti sighed. "I don't know if I can ever forget," she said honestly, "but I will not carry hate in my heart." Aduma nodded, her shoulders sagging. "I can't stay here. This village, it will never forget what we did. I will leave with my mother." Nabinti did not stop her. As Aduma turned and walked away, following the path of exile, it was clear. Zalira, once a woman of power, had now become nothing but a fading memory. And Nabinti, she had found something greater than revenge. She had found her true purpose. Years passed, and Nabinti's name became one spoken with admiration, not pity. No longer was she the helpless girl who had once trembled in the dark corners of Zalira's house. She was now a healer, a woman of wisdom, and a symbol of resilience. People from distant villages traveled to Zambalo just to see her, to hear her story, to seek her guidance. The scar on her back, once a source of shame, had transformed into something powerful. When young girls sat before her, their eyes filled with fear and doubt, she would turn her back to them and show them the deep, jagged letters burned into her skin. "This was meant to break me," she would say, "but instead, it made me stronger." Her story spread like wildfire, carried on the lips of travelers and elders alike. It reached women who had suffered in silence, men who had ignored the suffering around them, and children who now knew they had a voice. The name carved into her flesh no longer belonged to her stepmother. It belonged to the world as a warning, a lesson, a reminder that cruelty does not go unchallenged. One evening, Nabinti stood by the river where she had once collapsed, half dead and alone. She gazed at her reflection in the water, tracing the scar on her arm with her fingertips. The pain was gone, replaced with something far greater. Zalira had tried to brand her, to claim her as nothing more than an object of suffering. But Nabinti was no longer a victim. She was a survivor, a warrior, a woman who had taken her pain and turned it into power. And as the sun set behind the mountains, casting a golden glow over the village, Nabinti smiled. The name on her back did not define her. The strength in her heart did. If Nabinti's story touched your heart, if you felt her pain and witnessed her rise from the ashes, then you're not alone. There are so many people in the world, just like Nabinti, fighting battles in silence, whether it's against cruelty, injustice, or their own fears. But like Nabinti, they too can find the strength to rise. Her scars became a symbol of strength, and so can yours. Remember, no matter how dark the journey may seem, you have the power within you to overcome. If this story inspired you, if you believe in the power of resilience and the beauty of healing, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Let them know they are not alone, and that their strength can define them, not their past. If you haven't yet, please like this video, share it with your friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming stories like Nabinti's. We thank you for your support and for being part of this incredible journey. Your love and encouragement keep us going. Together, let's continue spreading hope, one story at a time. Thank you for watching.